The morning sunlight filtered through the dusty windows of Miller's grocery store as Sarah Chen stood behind the counter, her fingers trembling as she arranged cans of soup for the third time. At 17, she had learned to read the world through eyes that worked overtime, watching lips move, catching the shift in someone's posture that meant anger, noticing the subtle softening of features that signaled kindness. But today, those same observant eyes had detected something that made ice creep down her spine. The man in the torn jacket had been following her for 3 days. Sarah's mother had died when she was 9, leaving her father to raise her alone while working. Double shifts at the manufacturing plant across town. Money was always tight. And when Mr. Miller offered her an after-school job stocking shelves, Sarah had grabbed the opportunity with both hands. She needed to help. She needed to matter. Being deaf in a hearing world already made her feel invisible enough, at least here, organizing inventory and sweeping floors. She could prove her worth through action rather than words she couldn't hear. The man appeared again on Tuesday, lingering near the bread aisle while Sarah wiped down the refrigerator cases. He was tall, maybe in his late 30s, with dark circles under his eyes and clothes that had seen better days. When their eyes met accidentally, Sarah quickly looked away, her heart hammering. She'd seen enough true crime documentaries, with subtitles to know that being followed was never good. On Wednesday, he was there when she arrived at 4 o'clock and still there when she left at 8. Sarah's hands shook as she signed to Mr. Miller, explaining her fear. Her elderly boss squinted at her flying fingers, catching maybe half of what she conveyed, and patted her shoulder absently before shuffling back to his office. She was alone in this, as she was alone in so many things. By Thursday, Sarah's anxiety had crystallized into genuine terror. The man stood outside the store's front window for 45 minutes, just watching. When she took out the trash to the alley dumpster, she found him standing at the alley's entrance. Sarah dropped the garbage bag and ran back inside, her breath coming in panicked gasps as she locked the door behind her. She thought about calling the police, but stopped herself. What would she say? How would she communicate? The thought of trying to explain through hastily scribbled notes or a confused 911 operator made her feel even more powerless. So instead, she did what she always did. She stayed alert, stayed cautious, and tried to make herself smaller. Friday evening brought rain, the kind of heavy downpour that turned the streets into rivers and sent most sensible people running for cover. Sarah was closing the store alone. Mr. Miller had left early for a doctor's appointment. When she saw the man standing directly outside, rain streaming down his face, he made no move to seek shelter. He just stood there, staring at her through the glass. That's when Sarah broke. Her hands flew through signs she knew he couldn't understand, tears streaming down her face as frustration and fear overwhelmed her. Why was he doing this? What did he want? Was she going to become another tragic headline? The deaf girl nobody could help because she couldn't scream for assistance? Then the man did something unexpected. He held up a sign written on soggy cardboard in shaky handwriting. "Please, I need to talk to you. It's about your father." Sarah's world tilted. Her father? She hesitated for only a moment before unlocking the door and stepping back, one hand on her phone, ready to dial 911 if needed. The man entered slowly, water pooling around his worn sneakers. Up close, she could see he was younger than she'd thought, and there was something desperate and sad in his eyes that reminded her of her father when her mother had died. He reached into his jacket, Sarah tensed, and pulled out a photograph, now damp from the rain. She took it with trembling fingers. It showed a young man in military fatigues standing next to her father, both grinning at the camera with their arms around each other's shoulders. She'd seen photos of her dad from his army days before, but never this one. The man pulled out his phone and opened a notes app, typing quickly with cold, stiff fingers. He handed it to Sarah. The message read, "My name is David Martinez. Your father saved my life in Afghanistan. I was hit by an IED, lost my leg, PTSD. Your dad carried me 2 miles under fire. I never got to thank him properly. Then I lost everything, my wife, my home, my career. I've been homeless for 8 months. Last week I saw your dad getting groceries, followed him to find where he lived. Saw you leave for work. I wanted to thank him, but I was ashamed of what I'd become. So I followed you instead, trying to work up the courage. I know it was wrong. I'm so sorry I scared you." Sarah's hands had gone numb. She looked from the phone to David's face, seeing the truth written in every line of exhaustion and regret. She thought of her father, who never talked about his service, who worked himself to the bone to provide for her, who had learned sign language from library books because he refused to let her feel alone in silence. Without thinking, Sarah began to sign, then caught herself. She grabbed a notepad from behind the counter and wrote, "My dad never told me he saved anyone's life. He never talks about the war." David typed back, "The best men never do." They stood there in the quiet store, rain drumming on the roof. Two people connected by the invisible thread of one man's heroism. Sarah made a decision that would have terrified her an hour earlier. She wrote, "Stay here. I'm calling my dad." When Robert Chen arrived 20 minutes later, bursting through the door with panic in his eyes because Sarah's text had been cryptic, he stopped dead at the sight of David Martinez. For a long moment, the two men just stared at each other. Then David began to cry, and Sarah watched her father, her strong, stoic father who never showed emotion, cross the room and wrap this broken stranger in a fierce embrace. Over the next hour, Sarah learned things about her father she'd never known. She learned about the firefight in Kandahar, about David screaming for help while enemy bullets tore up the ground around them, about her father's refusal to leave a man behind even when ordered to retreat. She learned that her father had nightmares about that day, wondering if the men he'd served with were okay, carrying guilt for the ones he couldn't save. And David learned about Sarah, how her father had become fluent in American sign language, how he worked overtime to afford her specialized education, how he'd turned down promotions that would have required relocation because Sarah's school and support network were here. David's shame at his circumstances began to crack as he realized that the man who'd saved his physical life was still saving lives every single day. Robert Chen was a man of action, not words. That night, he made calls. He contacted the VA, leveraging connections from his service days to fast-track David's benefits claims that had been lost in bureaucracy. He reached out to a veterans support group he'd quietly volunteered with for years, securing emergency housing. He talked to the manager at his plant about job openings in maintenance, work that could accommodate David's prosthetic leg. But the most remarkable thing happened when Sarah, watching these two warriors reconnect, had an idea. She wrote on her notepad, "You were afraid to talk to Dad because of shame. I was afraid to ask for help tonight because of my disability. We both let fear make us invisible. Maybe we can help each other be seen." That moment sparked something transformative. Sarah began volunteering with the veterans group, teaching basic sign language to help vets with hearing loss from combat trauma. David, once he was stable with housing and employment, became an advocate for homeless veterans, his own story of redemption inspiring others to seek help without shame. And Robert Chen, the quiet hero who'd never sought recognition, finally allowed himself to feel proud of the lives he'd touched. The story spread through their community, not because Sarah sought attention, but because people needed to hear it. In a world that often feels cold and disconnected, here was proof that kindness ripples outward in ways we can't predict. A split-second decision in a war zone led to one saved life, which led to a father's devotion to his daughter, which led to an act of forgiveness in a rainy grocery store, which led to countless veterans getting help they desperately needed. 6 months later, Sarah stood before her high school at graduation, delivering her valedictorian speech through an interpreter. She spoke about the man who'd followed her, about fear and courage, about the invisible people all around us who are desperate to be seen. She spoke about her father, whose heroism wasn't loud or public, but lived in every sacrifice he'd made for her. And she spoke about David, who taught her that our lowest moments don't define us. How we rise from them does. In the audience, David sat next to Robert, both men in sharp contrast to that rainy night in the grocery store. David wore a suit for the first time in years, his new job as a veterans coordinator giving him purpose he'd thought lost forever. Robert wept openly, proud of his daughter in ways he'd never learned the words to express. The local news picked up the story eventually, but by then it had already done its most important work, not in headlines or viral videos, but in the quiet transformation of three lives that intersected when they needed each other most. Sarah's fear had turned to compassion. David's despair had turned to purpose. And Robert's silent heroism had finally received the acknowledgement he'd never sought but deeply deserved. Sometimes the most powerful stories aren't about grand gestures or dramatic rescues. Sometimes they're about standing in the rain, finding the courage to be vulnerable, and discovering that the person you're most afraid of might be the one who needs and offers salvation. Sarah learned that being deaf didn't make her powerless, that asking for help wasn't weakness, and that the most profound connections happen when we choose to see the humanity in others, even when fear tells us to look away. The poor deaf girl and the man who followed her became a testament to resilience, to second chances, and to the extraordinary power of choosing kindness over fear. Their story reminds us all. Everyone is fighting battles we can't see, and sometimes the bravest thing we can do is reach out into the darkness and trust that someone will reach back.